Abraham had a son of the promise named Isaac. Isaac had a son of the promise named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons and one daughter. The firstborn of those sons was Reuben, the secondborn was Simeon, and the third was Levi. Now Levi then had 3 sons. One was named Kohath, so his descendants are called the Kohathites. Kohath's uncle would have been Joseph, the one in Pharaoh's court, sold by his brothers. Now eventually, all 11 of Kohath's uncles, plus his aunt Dinah and his grandfather Jacob, they all eventually wound up in Egypt, and they were there for 430 years. During those 430 years in Egypt, they devolved into slaves. They were brick-making slaves. They carried mud and dirt on their shoulders to make the bricks. They carried straw on their shoulders to make the bricks. They carried water on their shoulders. Slavery was their life. There was no future for them. There was no promotion awaiting. There was no retirement. Only more of the same, carrying dirt, straw, dung, water on their shoulders. Now, near the end, one Egyptian stood in Tahrir Square with a little sign that said, "Let my people go." This Egyptian, Moses, who was really a Hebrew, an offspring of Levi, an offspring of Kohath, started bringing bigger and bigger signs to Tahrir Square. He brought 10 really big signs that we call plagues, until finally Pharaoh said, "Get out of here, you and your slave people, you people who carry dirt on their shoulders." They were free to journey back to the land of their parents, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They crossed the Red Sea as though on dry land, and they headed out into the desert. 600,000 men, plus women and children. Probably some 2 million people, all added up. Now they get out into the desert, and God has to start organizing them. Remember, they didn't have any kings yet. They didn't have any prophets. They didn't have the 10 Commandments. They're just 2 million motley slaves dumped out in the desert. They didn't have any skills like bow staff skills or nunchuck skills or computer hacking skills. All they knew how to do was to make bricks. So God begins to make them into a people. He gets them organized first into their families, and he gives instructions for getting along. He tells them the right way to hear from him, the right way to honor him. He gives them instructions on where to camp. He gives them instructions for a traveling church building. Now, there wasn't really a building. It was more like a big corral with curtains all around it. There was no roof. The columns around the perimeter were set in stands, and they held the curtains, which were suspended from beam poles. Beam poles. Now, inside of this corral, there was a place at the back that was called the Holy Place, and inside of that there was a place called the Holy of Holies, and this whole thing was called the Tabernacle, which is an old word which means God's tent. This tent's also called the Tent of Meeting. But before we can go any further, I've got to make sure you understand what I mean when I say this word holy. I said the place was called the Holy Place, and then the Holy of Holies. Well, what is that? Well, holy is pure good. It's uncontaminated good, which might sound nice to you, but that's because we've never experienced pure good. That purity is also restricted. It's a goodness so good, it's dangerous. It's a purity that can't help but consume anything impure. Holy is the pure goodness of God. No dirt allowed. It's not really that it's not allowed. That's not the right way to say it. It's more like the nature of this purity is aggressive. It will consume the impure. Maybe like pure oxygen, right? We all need oxygen to breathe, but if we were to breathe pure oxygen for very long, our bodies would run too hot and start to destroy themselves. Anyway, you get the idea. The holy place of God is wonderful, but also wonderfully dangerous. Now, as I reminded you, Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, third born, and it's Levi's descendants who become the religious worker in God's place. Some of his descendants got to be priests. Others have lesser positions, call them staff. And as you see, this difference eventually gets to be a problem. So they're all in this huge camp out in the desert. But from time to time, I mean, it is a camp, they have to move from one campsite to another. They're going to pack up. But who's going to move God's tent? It's the Kohathites. They are responsible for transporting God's tent. Now, some of the articles, like the curtains, can be placed on ox carts and pulled, but not the Kohathites. They are given the awesome responsibility of carrying the holy stuff on their shoulders. They can't just throw God's stuff in a cart. Only people can carry it. And these Kohathites are the most trusted of the family, who are chosen to carry the most important objects. They carry the Ark of the Covenant, the basin, which was like a huge sink, the altar, the lampstand, the table, the utensils. They carry it all on their shoulders. Out of the 600,000 men, these are the 2,750 special ones. Every time they had to move, first the packers came in, and they would wrap these precious articles, which we call furniture. They would wrap it well, first wrapped in cloth, either blue or red or purple, then wrapped in goat skins. And I said furniture. It's not quite right to call the pieces furniture. They really are like markers, like heads up, that identified the pure, restricted airspace of God. So they'd pack up the markers of this airspace, markers that said, careful now, you're near the voracious purity. And that may seem strange because, we preachers are always encouraging you to get closer to God, but you have to be careful to only approach Him in purity. And that's been our problem for a long time. In fact, that problem doesn't really get solved until the manger, the cross, and the tomb. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Back in the desert. So at any rate, the packers come in first. They wrap up God's furniture. Then they call in the Kohathites. So this is like a union job. Some people pack, some people carry. And these select Kohathites were the carriers of the precious, like the Sherpas of the divine. They didn't carry God around. I mean, they didn't have a statue of God, but they did move His stuff. The stuff that reminded people, you're near me. And then the whole 2 million people would set out following the cloud. First the priests, then the 2,750 Kohathites carrying the holy stuff on their shoulders. They followed the priests. They were not the priests. Sure, they had an important job, but they weren't the priests. That had been reserved for their cousins, the sons of Aaron, who were also of the tribe of Levi. And funny thing, guess who had chosen Aaron as priest? His brother, Moses. To some of the Kohathites, that seemed just a little bit like nepotism, kind of like a rigged election. The carrying Kohathites were not priests. They didn't get to wear the blue, purple, and scarlet garments. They didn't get to wear the turban, the headbands, the sash. They didn't get to wear the ephod or the breastpiece with its inlaid jewelry. The people didn't admire the Kohathites as they worked. And in fact, they're so near the holy objects that perhaps it makes them seem common to them. It takes the mystery out of the holy. It just becomes stuff they're lugging around. And they stop being impressed by the otherness of their task. They are carrying the holy on their shoulders, but not in their hearts. They're very near the place where God lives, but they become inured, calloused to this privilege. So in addition to carrying the holy things on their shoulders, they begin carrying a chip on their shoulders. Now, one of the Kohathites, a man named Korah, finds some co-conspirators. He finds 250 of them. They are equally upset at the injustice of their lot. Now these are 250 of the council members. These are people of standing and stature in the community. These are men who agreed that Moses and his brother and Aaron needed to get unelected. Being so near to the holy without discerning it emboldened them to rash and a tragic miscalculation. It's a dangerous business, this carrying of the holy things. This discontent bred a whisper. It bred a scheme which led to a plot, which led to a conspiracy. They decided they should return to Egypt, to return to the brick making. But first, they'd have to get rid of this Moses guy. So Korah and the 250 go to Moses and they confront him. You've gone too far. You've crossed the line. We are all God's children. What's more, everybody is holy. Everybody's special. Why do you set yourself up over everyone else? Now hear what Moses does. Here's how he responds to this challenge to his leadership. He falls face down in front of them. I mean, isn't that the last thing you want to do when challenged, to show this sign of weakness? This humble, stuttering man, Moses, is trying to lead 2 million slaves across the desert. Moses then stands up, dusts himself off, and says to them, no, it's you who have gone too far. Isn't it enough for you that God has given you this great opportunity and called you out of the pack and brought you near himself? Wasn't enough for you. You wanted more. You wanted to take the priesthood which was not given to you. You think you're complaining against me? You're not. You're complaining against God, and he's not one to mess with. Tomorrow, he says, be there at the tent of meeting. Bring your censers. So it's the big showdown. Showdown at the Holy Corral. Next morning, they all show up. Moses says to Korah, we're not going to vote. We're going to let God decide who is his choice. And that person will be able to come near him. Here's what I want you to do. Each one of you 250 men, take your bronze censers, put fire and incense in them, make it up yourself. You Levites, he said to them, have gone too far. And now Moses calls the other two ringleaders. Their names were Dathan and Abiram. He says, you guys come too. But they both refused to even come and talk. They said, isn't it enough that you've brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to die here in the desert? And now are you going to lord it over us as well? No, we will not do as you say anymore. We're staying here in our tents. So we've got over here this group of 250. And they bravely take their 250 censers with the incense in them, and they stand with Moses and Aaron there at the entrance to the tent of God. It says, the glory of the Lord appeared. We don't know all that means. But something really bright broke out, and they could see it, and it was coming to consume. God said to Moses, stand back, I'm going to kill them all. I have to warn you, this isn't cute little baby Jesus. This is a fearsome God of great proportion about which we can only begin to speculate, and Jesus was there. Now, in response to this, both Moses and Aaron fall down, face down, and they cry out, pleading for mercy for their enemies. Oh God, don't kill them all. Don't break out the glory. And God says, okay, but somebody's going to die today. The offense must be offset. The aggressive purity can't help but consume the contaminants. He says, stand back from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Move away from their tents. Don't even touch anything that's theirs, or you will be swept away because of all their sins. So Moses gets up. He goes to those two who wouldn't come to him. All the people, of course, follow him to see what's going to happen. Remember, this is the mob. This is the people who are complaining, ready to turn back to their slavery and their brick making. And now the rebel leaders stand by their tents with their wives, children, and infants. Moses calls out to everybody, This is how you'll know that the Lord is leading me. If these men die a natural death, the way all of us die, then you will know the Lord has not sent me. But if the earth opens up its mouth and swallows them, and they're buried alive, then you'll know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt, that they did not discern the holy. The earth groaned, it trembled, it stretched, and the earth itself opened up. And Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, along with their entire families and their tents, they fell screaming alive into the earth. And then, as quickly as it had opened up, the earth closed back as though nothing had happened, and they're gone, just like that, perhaps a bit of dust in the air. Quiet for an instant, while the crowd tries to understand what's just happened. But even as they're working to make sense of that, remember the 250 back over at the tabernacle? There are Aaron and the 250 rebels. They're still standing there with their censers, and now I suspect the 250 are a little more nervous. Fire shoots out from the tent, consuming the 250 men, not even singeing Aaron. The flames shoot out, just burn up the men. Their censers drop onto the ground, even as their ashes flutter down on top of them. They're gone. Moses calls Aaron's son Eleazar. He says, go collect all those 250 bronze censers. Take your hammer them into thin sheets of metal, and cover the altar with them. Let that be a sign, he said, so that every time anyone goes to the altar, they'll see those 250 pieces of bronze that used to be censers, and they will remember the aggressive purity that consumes. Now, I think if I've just seen the earth open up and swallow 3 rebel families, I'm going to be convinced. Or if not, I think that when I see 250 guys get cremated while standing with censers in their hand, I'm going to be convinced. But some people are hard to convince. Here they are. The very next day, the crowd's back at it. They come again to Moses and Aaron. They said, you killed them. It's your fault that they fell into a fault. God says to Moses, here we go again. Like I said yesterday, stand back. We've got to kill them all. And once again, Moses and Aaron throw themselves on the ground, on their faces, interceding for their people, even though their people were not really their people. But they're too late. Out in the mob, one after another, they simply drop dead. Life plucked out of them. The plague has begun. A crazy, infectious plague. Now, Aaron springs into action. He runs. He gets his incense burner. He quickly puts incense and fire in his censer, and he takes off. He's running among the complaining people, even as they begin to die by the aggressive purity that consumes. Frantically, Aaron runs into the middle of the people, back and forth. He's offering this incense for them. He's making atonement for them. He's rescuing his people. He's offsetting the offense. Aaron's path marked the path between the dead and the living, and the plague was halted. Even so, 14,700 more people died as that aggressive purity broke out in the middle of the schemers. The next day, there's dust in the air, ash blowing gently across the desert floor. In the distance, the hammering of the bronze censers into thin sheets. A sober people trying to understand this aggressive purity that consumes the impure. A people a lot like us trying to understand how might the impure approach this purity. A people a lot like us trying to understand that they need good news. A people a lot like us who recognize we need a mediator. We need someone to run between us and death. A people a lot like us who need a way to be made clean. The story will continue.